Have you ever noticed how certain people can instantly make your blood boil without even trying? They don't attack you. They don't insult you. They simply exist in a way that irritates you beyond reason. And suddenly you're consumed with judgment, frustration, an unexplainable urge to criticize or correct them. Now imagine if I told you that these people are not your enemies, they are your teachers. That every person who triggers you is showing you a hidden part of yourself that you've been desperately trying to deny. That's where the real revelation lies. You have been taught to look outward when someone bothers you, to focus on their flaws, their behavior, their problems. But here's a truth that perhaps no one has told you with this clarity. What irritates you about others is rarely about them at all. It's about you. Carl Jung said, "Everything that irritates us about others can lead us to an understanding of ourselves." But most people hear this quote and nod politely, never truly grasping its devastating implications. When someone's confidence bothers you, what does that reveal about your own relationship with self-assurance? When their success triggers resentment, what does that say about your own feelings of inadequacy? When their boundaries seem selfish to you, what might that expose about your own inability to say no? You think you're observing their character defects, but you're actually staring into a mirror that reflects the parts of yourself you've rejected, suppressed, or never learned to integrate. Jung called this psychological projection. You take the aspects of yourself that you cannot accept, your anger, your neediness, your selfishness, your weakness, and you unconsciously cast them onto others. Then you judge them harshly for displaying exactly what you're afraid exists within you. It's a brilliant defense mechanism, really. Instead of dealing with your own shadow, you make others carry it for you. But here's what most people don't realize. This mechanism operates completely outside your conscious awareness. You genuinely believe your irritation is justified. You create elaborate stories about why this person is problematic, why their behavior is unacceptable, why they need to change. Meanwhile, the real issue, the part of you that remains unhealed, unintegrated, unknown, continues to control your emotional responses from the darkness. Do you know why certain people can push your buttons so easily? Because those buttons were installed by your own unresolved psychological material. Every trigger is a wound. Every judgment is a confession. Every harsh reaction is your psyche screaming, "Look here, this is what you need to heal." The person who talks too much irritates you because you've silenced your own voice. The person who seems selfish bothers you because you've never learned healthy self-advocacy. The person who appears weak triggers you because you're terrified of your own vulnerability. They are not the problem. They are the invitation to wholeness you've been avoiding your entire life. And here's the cruelest point. The more violently you react to someone, the more you have in common with them. The traits that disgust you most in others are often the very qualities you possess but refuse to acknowledge. Your external enemy is your internal shadow made manifest. But instead of recognizing this gift, you waste your energy attacking the messenger while ignoring the message. This is why self-aware people rarely judge others harshly. They understand that judgment is projection, that criticism is confession, that triggers are invitations to self-discovery. When you truly know yourself, including your darkness, you stop being surprised by it in others. You stop being triggered because you stop being unconscious. Carl Jung didn't see the human psyche as a simple, unified whole. For him, our mind is a complex ecosystem where light and shadow coexist, where the person we think we are, our persona, lives alongside the person we refuse to be, our shadow. And it is precisely this shadow, the collection of traits we've deemed unacceptable, that creates our most intense triggers. Every judgment you make about another person reveals something specific about your own psychological landscape. When you criticize someone for being attention-seeking, you're revealing your own complicated relationship with visibility and recognition. When you condemn someone as manipulative, you're exposing your own discomfort with influence and persuasion. When you judge someone as lazy, you're projecting your own guilt about rest and self-care. But here's what makes this mechanism so insidious. Society teaches us that having these negative traits makes us bad people. So instead of integrating them consciously, we banish them to our unconscious. We create an idealized self-image that excludes anything messy, selfish, angry, or weak. But psychological energy cannot be destroyed. It can only be displaced. So these rejected aspects don't disappear. They go underground and begin operating through projection. This is why the most judgmental people are often the most unconscious about their own behavior. The person who constantly criticizes others for being fake is usually the most disconnected from their own authenticity. The person who rails against selfishness is often someone who has never learned to advocate for their own needs. The person who judges others for their weakness is typically terrified of their own vulnerability. Jung understood that this splitting of the psyche into good and bad parts is not just unhealthy, it's impossible to maintain. The shadow will always find ways to express itself, if not through conscious integration, then through unconscious projection, passive-aggressive behavior, sudden emotional outbursts, or attraction to people who embody what we've rejected in ourselves. Have you ever noticed how you sometimes attract exactly the kind of people who irritate you most? The controlling person who draws in partners they can criticize for being controlling. The people pleaser who surrounds themselves with individuals they can judge for being selfish. This isn't coincidence. It's your psyche's attempt to heal itself by forcing you to confront your own disowned aspects through others. But there's something even deeper happening here. Your triggers are not random. They follow patterns that reveal the specific ways you learn to survive emotionally as a child. If you were criticized for being too emotional, you might now judge others for their emotional expression while suppressing your own feelings. If you were shamed for having needs, you might criticize others for being needy, while never acknowledging your own legitimate requirements for care and attention. These early adaptations created what Jung called complexes, autonomous psychological structures that operate outside conscious control. Your triggers are these complexes activating. When someone displays a trait that your complex deems dangerous or unacceptable, it hijacks your rational mind and floods you with emotion. You think you're responding to them, but you're actually responding to your own unhealed past. This is why rational arguments rarely change someone's triggers. You can't logic your way out of an unconscious pattern. The person who judges others for being weak won't suddenly stop because you explain that vulnerability is actually strength. Their judgment is protecting them from confronting their own terror of being seen as inadequate or helpless. Jung said that we don't become enlightened by imagining figures of light, but by making the darkness conscious. Your triggers are pointing you directly toward your own darkness, not to shame you, but to liberate you. Every person who irritates you is offering you a piece of your soul that you've lost or denied. But most people would rather stay triggered than face this uncomfortable truth. And here's what's truly tragic. By refusing to own your shadow, you give it tremendous power over your life. You become predictable, reactive, controlled by whoever happens to activate your unconscious material. You lose your center, your peace, your sovereignty, all because you'd rather judge others than know yourself. But what happens when you finally turn the mirror inward? What changes when you stop seeing enemies and start seeing teachers? What becomes possible when you reclaim your projections and integrate your shadow. That is what we will explore next. Because the path to freedom doesn't run around your triggers, it runs directly through them. It's no use understanding projection intellectually if in practice you continue to blame others for your emotional reactions. True transformation begins when you develop the courage to ask a different question. Instead of, "Why is this person so irritating?" you ask, "Why am I so irritated?" Instead of, "What's wrong with them?" you ask, "What is this revealing about me?" This shift in questioning is the beginning of what Jung called individuation, the process of becoming whole by integrating all aspects of yourself, including the ones you've rejected. But this requires something most people are unwilling to give: radical honesty about your own psychological patterns. The first step is learning to catch yourself in the act of projection. The next time someone triggers you intensely, pause, breathe. Instead of immediately constructing a case against them, get curious about your own reaction. What specifically bothers you about their behavior? What story are you telling yourself about why they're wrong? What emotions are you experiencing? Anger, disgust, contempt, fear. Now comes the uncomfortable part. Look for that same trait in yourself. Not the identical behavior, but the same underlying energy or impulse. The person whose confidence irritates you. Where in your own life do you struggle with self-assurance? Where do you either overcompensate or hide your own capabilities? The person whose neediness bothers you. What needs of your own have you never learned to express directly? This isn't about self-blame or harsh self-criticism. It's about self-awareness. Jung understood that the shadow isn't evil. It's simply unconscious. These rejected parts of yourself aren't inherently bad. They're just underdeveloped, unexpressed, or inappropriately suppressed. Your selfishness might actually be healthy self-advocacy that you learn to call bad. Your anger might be appropriate boundary setting that you were taught to see as mean. But here's where most people get stuck. They intellectually recognize their projections, but continue to judge themselves for having these negative traits. This creates a double bind, where you can't escape the shadow through awareness alone. You need integration, not just recognition. Integration means finding healthy ways to express these rejected aspects of yourself. If you judge others for being selfish, practice healthy self-advocacy. If you criticize others for being weak, learn to be vulnerable appropriately. If you condemn others for being angry, find constructive ways to express your own boundaries and power. This process is deeply uncomfortable because it challenges your entire self-concept. You've built your identity around not being certain things, not being selfish, not being weak, not being angry. But Jung understood that psychological wholeness requires embracing the full spectrum of human experience. You can't become complete by cutting off pieces of yourself. As you begin this work, expect pushback, both internal and external. Your ego will resist because it's invested in your current self-image. Your nervous system might become activated as you explore previously forbidden territory. And the people around you might react strangely as you begin expressing aspects of yourself that you've kept hidden. But something magical begins to happen as you reclaim your projections. The people who used to trigger you intensely start to lose their power over your emotional state. Not because they've changed, but because you've stopped giving them the job of carrying your disowned psychological material. You might notice that your harsh judgments soften into curiosity. Instead of being irritated by someone's confidence, you become interested in how they develop such self-assurance. Instead of being triggered by someone's boundaries, you appreciate their self-respect. Instead of being disgusted by someone's vulnerability, you're moved by their courage to be authentic. This doesn't mean you become permissive or lose your ability to discern healthy from unhealthy behavior. Shadow integration actually improves your judgment because it's no longer clouded by projection. You can see others more clearly because you're not using them as screens for your own unresolved material. But perhaps most importantly, you begin to experience what Jung called psychological sovereignty, the state of being governed by your own conscious choices rather than your unconscious reactions. You stop being a victim of your triggers because you understand that they're not attacks from the outside world. They're invitations from your own psyche to become more whole. This work requires tremendous emotional discipline. You'll need to develop the capacity to sit with uncomfortable emotions without immediately projecting them onto others. You'll need to question your most cherished judgments and consider that your reactions might say more about you than about the people who trigger them. And you'll need to practice what Jung called active imagination, the ability to consciously engage with the unconscious aspects of yourself rather than letting them operate through projection. This might mean journaling about your triggers, exploring them in therapy, or simply developing more curiosity about your own psychological patterns. But here's what makes this work not just worthwhile, but essential. Every projection you reclaim is a piece of your power returned to you. Every trigger you integrate is a way you stop giving others control over your emotional state. Every shadow aspect you embrace is a step toward becoming truly free. Not because you've eliminated your darkness, but because you've learned to work with it consciously. The goal isn't to become a person without triggers or judgments. The goal is to become someone who recognizes their triggers as information rather than truth, who uses their judgments as starting points for self-inquiry rather than final verdicts about others. But what happens when you've done this work? What becomes possible when you've integrated your shadow and reclaimed your projections? What does life look like when you're no longer controlled by your triggers, but empowered by your wholeness? In the final part, we will explore this transformation, the rebirth that comes from embracing all of who you are. When you stop projecting your shadow onto others, something profound begins to happen. First comes the silence, not the absence of judgment, but the presence of clarity. You encounter people who used to trigger you intensely, and you feel nothing. Not because you've become cold or indifferent, but because you've reclaimed the power you were unconsciously giving them. The person who used to irritate you with their confidence now simply exists as someone confident. Their self-assurance no longer threatens your own sense of worth because you've developed your own relationship with personal power. The person whose boundaries used to seem selfish to you now appears as someone who knows their own value. Their self-advocacy no longer triggers your guilt because you've learned to honor your own needs. But this transformation goes deeper than simply becoming less reactive. You begin to experience what Jung called psychological wholeness, the integration of all aspects of yourself, both light and shadow. And with this wholeness comes a profound shift in how you move through the world. You no longer need others to be different for you to feel okay. You stop requiring external validation for your internal choices. You cease trying to control other people's behavior to manage your own emotional state. This isn't indifference, it's freedom. The freedom that comes from being complete within yourself. People will notice this change in you, though they might not understand it. You become less reactive, less judgmental, more present. You develop what Jung called the transcendent function, the ability to hold paradox, to embrace complexity, to work with your triggers rather than being controlled by them. You can be both strong and vulnerable, both generous and boundaried, both confident and humble. Your relationships transform dramatically. Some connections will end because they were built on mutual projection rather than genuine intimacy. The people who were drawn to your idealized persona might drift away when you begin expressing your authentic wholeness. This isn't loss, it's liberation from relationships that required you to remain unconscious. But the relationships that survive this transformation become infinitely richer. When you stop projecting your shadow onto others, you can finally see them clearly. When you stop needing them to be perfect, you can appreciate their complexity. When you stop judging their darkness, you can celebrate their light. These relationships are built on truth rather than illusion, on acceptance rather than expectation. Perhaps most importantly, you develop what Jung called ethical responsibility for your shadow. You acknowledge your capacity for cruelty while choosing kindness. You accept your selfish impulses while acting generously. You recognize your manipulative abilities while using them ethically. This isn't moral perfection, it's conscious choice. You become someone who acts from awareness rather than reacts from unconsciousness. Your energy begins to flow differently. Instead of being drained by constant judgments and emotional reactions, you feel energized by your own wholeness. The psychological energy that was previously trapped in projection and reactivity is now available for creativity, growth, and genuine contribution. You stop being a victim of your triggers and become the author of your responses. But here's what might surprise you. This integration doesn't make you soft or permissive. If anything, it makes you more discerning. When your judgment is no longer clouded by projection, you can see situations and people more clearly. You can distinguish between what needs to be accepted and what needs to be addressed. You can respond appropriately rather than react unconsciously. You also discover something that Jung understood deeply. Your triggers were never your enemies. They were your teachers. Every person who irritated you was offering you a gift, the opportunity to reclaim a lost piece of yourself. Every judgment was an invitation to greater self-knowledge. Every projection was a pathway to wholeness. This realization brings with it a profound sense of gratitude, even for the people who triggered you most intensely. You recognize that they were unconsciously serving your individuation process, pointing you toward the parts of yourself that needed integration. They were mirrors reflecting your own unconscious material back to you, even if neither of you understood it at the time. Now, instead of being triggered by others' shadows, you recognize them with compassion. Not pity or superiority, but genuine understanding. Because you know intimately the struggle of being human, of carrying both light and darkness, of being beautifully, messily, completely imperfect. You see their triggered reactions not as attacks, but as invitations for them to do their own inner work. This doesn't mean you become a therapist for everyone, or try to heal others through your understanding. Shadow integration teaches you about appropriate boundaries and the difference between empathy and enmeshment. You can recognize others' psychological patterns without taking responsibility for their healing. You can offer compassion without sacrificing your own well-being. You also develop a new relationship with conflict and difficult emotions. Instead of avoiding them or projecting them onto others, you learn to work with them directly. Anger becomes information about your boundaries. Jealousy becomes guidance about your unmet desires. Contempt becomes invitation to examine your own self-rejection. Every difficult emotion becomes a doorway to greater self-understanding, rather than evidence that someone else needs to change. This is the rebirth Jung spoke of. Not the elimination of your shadow, but its conscious integration. Not the absence of triggers, but the wisdom to use them as teachers. Not the perfection of your character, but the wholeness of your humanity. You are no longer controlled by what you cannot accept in others because you have learned to accept it in yourself. And in that acceptance, you find a freedom that no amount of judgment could ever provide. You become someone who can hold the full spectrum of human experience with grace. who can embrace the totality of what it means to be human. This is true psychological maturity. Not the absence of difficult traits, but the conscious relationship with them. Not the elimination of your shadow, but the integration of it. Not the perfection of your persona, but the authenticity of your whole self. And from this place of integration, you become capable of genuine love, not the conditional love that depends on others being who you want them to be, but the unconditional love that accepts them as they are. Because you have learned to love yourself in your totality, you can extend that same acceptance to others. Today, we learned from Carl Jung that our triggers are not obstacles to overcome, but teachers to embrace, and that true psychological freedom comes not from eliminating our shadow, but from integrating it consciously. If these insights sparked a moment of recognition for you, hit the like button to share this wisdom with others who might need to hear it. Subscribe to join our PSYphile community, where we dive deeper into life-changing psychological insights every week. Become a PSYphile and explore more ideas that transform how we see ourselves and the world. Now tell me in the comments, what trigger of yours are you ready to explore as a teacher rather than an enemy? Are you willing to look in the mirror instead of pointing fingers? Write, "I choose integration," if you're ready to begin this journey of wholeness. Until we meet again, remember that Jung's wisdom reminds us, every person who irritates you is offering you the gift of self-discovery. The question is whether you're brave enough to unwrap it. Take a moment to like this video and subscribe to our YouTube channel, PSYphile. And don't forget, keep watching the next video where we explore how your dreams reveal the parts of yourself you've forgotten. See you there, fellow PSYphile.